So, Roger Moorhouse, it is 108 years today that the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed, and we are going to make the case in this Bus in Brief, which is a 10-minute segment of historical joy, that the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was one of the most seminal, important, and world-changing moments of the 20th century. And at the end, we're going to recommend a couple of really brilliant books to read if you're interested. So stay right until the end for that. So, Roger Moorhouse, it's 1980, it's early March, set the scene. Is there a war on or something?
Yeah, so World War One, obviously we know now with benefit of hindsight, World War One is going into its last year. 17, the year before, Russia had been convulsed by revolution. There had been two revolutions. The Tsar had fallen in the spring, and then subsequently the Bolsheviks had taken power in October, November, depending on your calendar. So the Bolsheviks under Lenin are essentially in charge. They're still pretty fresh to the job, and Russia has been convulsed. I mean, that's why revolutions in 1917 had happened. The country has been absolutely ravaged in World War One, and there had been an armistice signed with the Central Powers, the Germans, the Austro-Hungarians, and the Bulgarians, and the Turks, incidentally. They signed an armistice with them in December of 1917, right? And the Bolsheviks basically, they convene like a week after the armistice to sort of hammer out peace terms in the normal way. But the Bolsheviks had strung out the negotiations for the peace talks in the hope and the expectation. Bear in mind, these are not. I was say these are not normal people. These are revolutionaries. Russia is a rogue state. But this is like that they are anticipating that what has happened to them, the revolution that's happened, Marxism, Leninism. They've told themselves and anyone that would listen that this is going to change the world. This is the ideology that is holds all the answers to everything, and this is going to blow away everything. The capitalist system, the old all of the parliamentary democracies and the autocracies and everything else. This was the future, as far as they were concerned. So they go into these negotiations basically trying to string them out in the expectation and the hope that the Western powers will collapse as well. So their negotiating partners across the table, their countries will also collapse into revolution in the same way as it had in Russia. So that's the way they go into it. So they're basically stalling all the time. One of the really interesting aspects is, as part of that sort of time-wasting procedure, is the people that they invite into their own delegation, right? The Soviets, with one eye on diversity, invite soldiers, sailors, and peasants to join their delegation in the negotiations, right? So the German side and the Austrian side, you've got Prince this and Grand Duke that, and Field Marshal the other, and then on the Soviet side, you've got some politicians as well. So Trotsky turns up as well in due course, but you've also got illiterate peasants sitting there. So you've got this bizarre situation. And one of the Soviet delegation is actually an assassin. Her name was Anastasia Bitsenko, and she had murdered the Russian Minister of War in 1905. So you've got this real motley crew of representatives on the Soviet side, and they're basically trying to kick the can down the road as far as they can. They're arguing about the minutiae that the Germans and Austrians are trying to sort of pin down. They're essentially appealing above their heads to the domestic audience in Central Europe and in Germany to try and foster revolution there. And they're using the whole thing basically as a platform to spread revolutionary sentiment. So this is the situation that you've got in the sort of, take it up to about February of 1918.
So that's the scene in Brest-Litovsk. Back in Petrograd, Lenin is really struggling to keep on top of things. As anybody who watches leftist politics will know, the party is riven and half paralysed by infighting over the things that matter. They can't reach decisions. Lenin is pushing for peace. Stalin is kind of in his corner. He's Lenin's pet at this moment. Trotsky is pushing for this kind of clever delaying. Lenin kind of now wants peace just signed. Meanwhile, the German terms, having started off draconian, moved to being ultra uber draconian. I can't even say it now, draconian. So talk us through the actual signing. How do they get there?
Yeah, so as I said, the Soviet delegation is kind of trying to kick it down the road. Trotsky comes in. He has an idea of neither war nor peace. So he's basically saying, look, we're out of the war, we're not fighting anymore, but we're not going to sign a peace treaty. So they're just kind of trying to delay and obfuscate as best as possible. The Germans get frustrated with that, obviously. And in February 1918, they deliver an ultimatum to their negotiating partners and basically say, you've got 48 hours to get serious, to come back to the table and get serious. And you've got 78 hours after that to conclude terms. Otherwise, we're going to carry on with our military operations, which they then do. So the Germans start the ball rolling of their military sort of rolling over what are now abandoned trenches and abandoned Russian positions and so on. And this means that the Soviet side do get serious, and they finally come to the table and they have to agree essentially what the Germans give them, which is, as you say, a pretty draconian peace. So just to look at the headline terms of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, 3rd of March 1918, so Russia is to withdraw from the war. Okay, that's what they wanted, the Bolsheviks anyway, but it is to lose Finland, which is effectively already lost, is to lose the Baltic provinces that we know will become independent in due course. It will lose most of Belarus. It will lose all of Ukraine. And also to some other isolated territories in the Western Caucasus. The end result of all of that is that Russia, as in taking from our benchmark pre-war Russian Empire, would lose 34% of its population, 54% of its industrial land, 89% of its coal fields, which is basically the Donbass, 26% of its railways. It will also have to pay 6 billion marks in indemnity to the Germans. So this is absolutely, to use your word, draconian. But the Soviets have got no choice.
It's not looking sunny for the Soviets. I mean, that's absolutely stunning. It's almost one of the worst peace treaties in history, surely. Yeah. I mean, it's absolutely horrific. And actually, the Allied powers looking at this and looking at the German terms are kind of spooked into thinking, well, we can't negotiate peace with the Germans. They're unreasonable. These terms are insane. And of course, less than a year down the line, they're going to be negotiating themselves at Versailles, and they're going to take a leaf out of the Germans' own books on draconianism with terrible consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of consequences, this is why it's significant. And of course, just to jump forward a bit, as we know, so this is signed March 1918, and as we know, the Germans themselves collapse into revolution and defeat and sue for peace in November of 1918. So at which point, the terms of Brest-Litovsk become, null and void. So the treaty is then null and void. Everything is back up for grabs. So in that sense, you might look at Brest-Litovsk and say, well, nothing much happened. It was only enforced for like 7 or 8 months, and then it ceased to be. But there's a good case, an argument to be made, as you say, that looking at the terms of Brest-Litovsk and how draconian they were influenced the Allies in their later negotiations at Versailles. And that might be one of the reasons why Versailles was as, again, draconian or brutal as it was. And also that principle of self-determination, because this is another thing that the Germans had tried to impose on the Soviets at Brest-Litovsk. So they'd say, oh, we didn't want to annex territory initially, but we want all of those liminal states, Belarus, Ukraine, the Baltic states, we're going to apply self-determination to them, and they will decide whether they want to be in the Russian Empire or not. And of course they knew that they wouldn't. So they not necessarily that they'd end up as German fiefdoms, which they did, but so self-determination as a weapon is used at Brest-Litovsk, and it will be used at Versailles as well. So
beyond, of course, it reshapes Europe in a way that creates problems and creates vacuums and creates rivalries that will explode again.
Yeah, absolutely. And incidentally, you mentioned all of those internal rivalries in the Bolshevik Party and in Russia. If you jump forward, only a couple of months to the summer of 1918, one of those groups that was particularly unhappy was the left social revolutionaries. One of their representative at the talks was actually the assassin, as I said, Anastasia, the assassin of the Minister of War. And they fell out with the Bolsheviks over accepting Brest-Litovsk because they thought they should just press on, the time-wasting strategy. Revolution is bound to come because, of course, it's scientific. All of that stuff is in their heads.
It's been foretold. And it's been foretold that it will come in Germany as well.
Yeah, of course, it has to come in Germany. So that's the key thing, is Germany is absolutely central to this. But in that rift with the Bolsheviks, the left SRs actually assassinate the German ambassador to Russia, a chap called Baron von Mirbach, in July 1918. And the hope that, they do that in the hope that the Germans will be so outraged that they themselves will tear up the treaty and invade again and, throw the whole thing up in the air. That doesn't happen, but poor old Mirbach, of course, is killed. So there are real world consequences to all of this, even though the terms of the treaty are annulled, 7 months later.
I think one of the things that it serves to focus the mind on as well is the unlikely extraordinariness of a small band of gangsters taking over one of the biggest empires in the world at the time by landmass, managing to wrest control of it, losing half of it, and then going on to consolidate control and regaining it. And, one of the first instruments that helped Lenin do that was, it was that summer of 1918 that he introduced the Red Terror, and had killed within 2 months more people than the Tsarists had killed in the entire century before. Terror was not a Stalinist invention, it was a Leninist invention. And one of the reasons it was necessary was to kind of regain a modicum of control after the humiliation of Brest-Litovsk. So, it had seismic knock-on effects for the Soviets, for the Bolsheviks, for the peoples of Europe who had been under Russian control and were then subsequently wrestled over by the Soviets again.
If you jump forward to now, right, and Ukraine is wrestling for its position both as an independent state and also, to be Western orientated like it wants to be. If you look at the map of Russia's Western borderlands in 1918, according to the Brest-Litovsk, it's very, very similar to what its Western borderlands would be if Ukraine is successful in that venture. So, that was a frontier and that was a treaty that in 1918 was absolutely unacceptable to vast swathes of Russian opinion. And you can kind of see why, a root behind the Ukraine conflict as well, because it's unacceptable now to a vast swathes of Russian opinion as well. However justified the case might be for the Ukrainians, from a Russian perspective, this does not look good. It looks like a humiliation. So there's echoes of Brest-Litovsk in what we're doing now with Ukraine. So
Absolutely.
That point needs to be made. I had a couple, going back to books, so the long time ago. So John Wheeler-Bennett was, great historian of Germany and of interwar diplomacy and so on. He did what is still, I think, one of the most thoroughgoing studies of this. It was called The Forgotten Peace, Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which came out a long time ago. And if you can find one, it's very, very solid. It's very good. It's old school, but it's very, very good. There are a couple of treatments in other books that I've certainly read recently. Nick Lloyd's Eastern Front, which came out a couple of years ago, which is brilliant. Again, very, very thorough. He obviously covers it in that grand sweep of the war on the Eastern Front, and also Anthony Beaver in his Russia, Revolution and Civil War, which came out 5 years ago perhaps. He covers it in there as well, and in typical kind of in typical Beaver style. It's very, very well done. So there's a couple of sort of partial studies and one very solid, albeit old, study. What about you?
Well, I would echo you. My favourite book on the Russian Revolution in recent years was by Sean McMeekan, and he's good on this. He's good on
Great
everything.
historian.
So yeah, those are the ones. All right, lovely. Thank you, Roger. See you next
Wonderful.
time.